Hello,
Hi,
Mr.
Rob.
Tim. Hey, how you doing?
All right, how are you?
All good, thank you.
Thanks very much for agreeing to have a discussion about FE. It's great to see you. So I was going to ask you some questions. I hope that's okay.
Of course it is.
So here's my first one, and obviously this relates to how you're engaging with the circumstances now. But I just wonder, what's the situation been like for the students and for the staff who are starting this new term at City College, which is where you're currently working as vice principal, is that right?
That's correct.
Uh,
Vice Principal, responsible for curriculum quality and student support services.
and how long have you been there?
I was supposed to be there for a short time in an interim capacity, and I'm just coming past my second year.
Long interim then.
Yes, and going on a little longer.
I see. So how does it feel this term, as it were, in City College, in the middle of Southampton?
I think the first thing I'd say is it's actually good to be back physically in college. As most people listening will know, whether they've got children, know of children in further education, schools or universities, that they've been out of education formally since March. So that's a kind of good 6 months of being out of formal education. So it's been good to welcome people back. What we've done at City College, and I think most further education colleges have done the same, is that we've come back incrementally. So we delayed the start of our full teaching week before the start of the full teaching year by a week, so that we could bring back our study program students, our younger students, for an induction week in kind of small groups. So we could get them used to coming back into college with face masks and hand washing and bubbles and limited use of the campus, and then learning from them as they're coming in greater numbers about how things need to change for when our adult students came in, which was the beginning of this week, and when our apprentices come in, our new apprentices come in at the beginning of next week, and then we are back as a full college with new ways of working and new ways of kind of behaving whilst on campus. And
So that's at least three different kinds of students that you're working with there that you mentioned, the younger members of your student body, the ones who are adult learners, and then the
yeah,
apprenticeship. Is that correct?
yeah, we've got a fourth where we have two school groups that come in to us for 1 day a week, and that's a cohort of 12 students from two different schools, one studying for an engineering qualification and the other studying for a construction qualification. And then we support, I think it's some in the region of about 20 younger people, 14, 16, who are electively home educated. So we will be their main provider throughout the duration of their what would have been their GCSE years.
But you said 3,000 students.
Yeah. So we've got just over 1,016 to 18-year-olds. Once we're at full capacity, we'll have some in the region of about 1,500 adults, and about 500 apprentices will come through our doors regularly.
Do you think most
And we're a
people?
small college.
Yeah, I was going to say, wow.
Yeah.
Do you think most people are aware of just how big FE colleges are?
No is the short answer. And I think that speaks to a larger point about how many people know about further education generally. I think some people will have an indication of what they think further education is if they've experienced it, or they might know about it because somebody's done an apprenticeship or somebody's done a specific course. But the size of the organisation or organisations, and like I said, City College is a small college on one campus with a kind of supporting site delivering marine. and yeah, so I don't think people would fully recognise what a GFE is, and therefore would not necessarily know how many students will be attending.
So I think in Winchester Diocese, we have quite a number of FE colleges, and so some would be bigger than City.
Absolutely, yeah. City's probably, as a general further education college, taking out the sixth form colleges, City would be one of the smallest, if not the smallest. Yeah, and you've got other colleges like Hammond and Southdown College, Hammond and Southstones College, which is big and getting bigger. And then you'll have other colleges which I'd say were in the middle of the road, such as Eastleigh, Basingstoke, Farnborough, Fareham.
Sparshot. So it's a whole sector that possibly remains in some ways largely unknown, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think I've done some research on in further education for a PhD that I did a little while ago, and my favourite quote that I found as part of the literature review was, further education is often defined by what it isn't and what it is. Right. So it isn't school and it isn't HE.
And yet it often is delivering things that are delivered at school, and it's also delivering HE.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's got the whole breadth from, you alluded to it earlier about the different levels of courses. So we're delivering qualifications at what we refer to as entry level or milestones for students with learning difficulties or disabilities. We're offering qualifications for people whose English is a second language, right up to HNDs, HNCs, foundation degrees. So right up to level 5, so degree level study, and everything in between.
So having described a little bit of what FE is like now, how do you see FE developing in the future, and how do you see the future of FE relating to the future of our society and the development of our industry and commerce?
Yeah, in some ways, there's lots of talk in government about the FE of the future, and we're expecting a white paper about further education coming out in the next few months. And everything that I've really read about the further education college of the future, I think restates the aims that the current system strives to deliver, and that is that it's an educational organisation that supports the needs of its community. It's an educational organisation that supports the needs of the local economy, sometimes the regional economy. And it's also an educational institution that supports the needs of employers that are within the area, so constantly kind of refreshing their workforce. So when we talk about the further education college of the future, I think we're already in that future, and I think it's always been something that the further education sector has been expected to deliver, strives to deliver, and in most cases already delivers.
So people talk about the fourth industrial revolution. Are you saying that FE is sort of key to us taking hold of that?
Yeah, and because I think we've always been, when there's a kind of an economic shift, or when the government changes its priorities on what the workforce of the future will look like, FE is the quickest education sector to deliver on that, whether it's through apprenticeships or whether it's through high level technical education. It's always been at the forefront. So in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, I think we'll be right at the front of delivering on that.
And yet, given that, how is it that in the British culture particularly, we seem to prioritise the professions as opposed to the vocations? We seem to think that higher education is better than further education. I mean, what are the roots of that, given what you've just said?
Yeah, and again, I've been thinking about this, and I think in some ways, I think it comes down to two things. and that is the further education sector is still relatively, or by comparison to schools and universities, a new sector. Universities and the first schools have been run for hundreds of years and have had that opportunity to develop into what we know and love. Whereas the further education sector from incorporation has been around since the early 90s, and in a form that we recognize as probably only started to get to where it is in its embryonic nature from the Second World War. So it's still a relatively new sector by comparison. And I think the second point is that it still goes back to the point I made. It's still constantly defined by what it isn't than what it is. So there's a lack of clear thinking about what further education is, and as a result, it's constantly prone to change, because either different administrations, government administrations, come in and think it should deliver something else. So it's never really had time to embed what it does brilliantly. It's just it's the fact that it keeps changing means that people don't get to know it before it changes again. So that lack of understanding then continues.
So what do we need to do to actually make it more understandable, as it were, of the people that FE means this, or FE is developing in this direction? How do people better get a grip of what it is that FE offers? I mean, what is it that it does offer to the community, in a nutshell?
Yeah,
really?
yeah. In a nutshell, I think further education colleges generally offer vocational, occupational education and training. And whilst we talk, because we've got a long history of A levels and degrees, when anything comes into the news, let's take COVID as an example, all the news comes out about COVID on how it's going to affect schools and how it's going to affect universities. Nobody ever really mentions further education. And every time that there's an education story nationally or locally, schools are mentioned and universities are mentioned. So I think even as basic as raising the profile of FE through talking about it gives people the opportunity to then go and look at it, in the same way that if people are looking for schools and universities, they know they exist, so they'll go and look for them. If nobody ever talks about further education or the further education sector.
So actually, just better public recognition would be one action that would value FE and help people to make sense of its contribution to the local community more widely.
As you said, that public recognition would be helpful when either the government or local or national broadcasters talk about education. They do talk about it as in its widest sense, including FE.
So if people were to understand this practically, you would say that FE has made a significant contribution to how we're coping with the COVID crisis? And could it make a significant contribution to how we're going to cope with the possibly even bigger crisis of our environmental degradation?
Yes. Well, I think it's already coped with it, as every other educational organisations coped with it. We had about a week and a half's notification that we were going to cease face-to-face teaching. So for us, that at that stage, we probably had about 5,000 students and apprentices on our books. So it's moving a week and a half to move away from face-to-face teaching into the world of virtual delivery. And we did that as as other educational providers did it, with speed, with pace, and on the whole, with success. And that's how we continued through the summer term, conscious that there are some people who couldn't access online activity, either because they didn't have access at home, or they had a particular learning need, but we supported those through sending work directly to them to complete. And as we come back, what we can already see is that there's potentially an educational deficit in those young people that we wouldn't have seen previously, that whilst they're in further education and whilst they're in post-16 education, we will seek to make up that educational deficit for as long as they're with us, in the hope that that can be made up. So what they then go on to do after they're with us isn't impacted as a result. And then for the others, we know that unemployment's increasing and is going up. So I think further education has always played a part in retraining and upskilling and preparing younger people and adults for the new world of work. And as initiatives come on board, or as we open our doors to a wider pool of people, we will seek to prepare them for whatever's their next stage kind of involves. So, okay.
But we see on the TV the lab technicians working on vaccines, and would it be true to say that they probably trained in an FE college? And then we see people involved in environmental care initiatives, and very often there are people helping out in the most practical ways and in vocational ways to actually make a difference in a particular project. Again, would it be the FE training that has enabled them to do that?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of broad response to the kind of creating vaccines. And I remember when I worked at another college, which had a scientific research base quite close to it. And when we were in dialogue with them about their workforce, and they'll be probably working on the COVID-19 and the response to it, is that actually they said everybody who works for us in terms of the science and the research has a PhD. We don't need any more PhDs. What we need are technicians, people qualified to level 4 and 5. We don't need more masters and more PhD people, but we can't get those level 4, 5 qualified technicians. And therefore, through partnership with the college that I was at the time, that was the college's response to supporting the scientific arm of that research base through apprenticeships and through high level qualifications. And again, there'll be colleges up and down the country who've had similar conversations with their local science or research labs, or even with their university partners, and will be responding or have already responded in such a way.
That's where FE helps people either to retrain or to continue with their education so that they can make a contribution to lots of things that we take for granted. Rob, I was going to ask you, what difference does your faith make to the work that you're involved in? And is it obvious, or is it sort of in the background? How do you find the connections working?
So I think the first thing that I'd say is that I'm quite public in work about the fact that I'm a Christian, and everybody in the college knows that I'm training to be a vicar in its broadest sense. So I think it's really important for me to be honest with people about my faith, and in doing that, that's actually opened up the opportunity that for people to come to me in a personal capacity or on a one-to-one basis, whether they have faith or have no faith, to talk about a range of situations, which is such a privileged position to be in. So I'd say being open about my faith is really important to me, and it can't be something that's in the background. I don't have a choice that I'm a Christian, so I need to tell people that I don't have this choice. And then in terms of what faith, how my faith plays its role, I think in a number of ways. At the foundation of our faith, the Bible clearly tells us we are all made in God's image. And if I believe that to be true, which I do, then that comes without question or hesitation. So so when we look to build up that society that we've mentioned, that means that nobody can be left behind, or nobody should be left behind. So everything that I do in terms of my work, when I look at the society that we are trying to support and build and develop around Southampton or whichever college I'm working at, the fact that we're all made in God's image is at the centre for me, that we don't leave anybody behind. As a Christian, we are called to live out the example and witness of Jesus Christ where we are. And when I was growing up, and I think this is where my love of FE comes into its own, was that I actually didn't do very well in secondary education. I actually left secondary school with 1 GCSE. And if it wasn't for the fact that my music teacher, who was a Christian, took a risk on me, and if it wasn't that when I got to further education college, the 2 other Christian teachers didn't take a risk on me to put me into A-level classes and allowed me to get to university, actually, I don't know where I would be. My family aren't people who have gone to university. So the fact that they lived out the witness and example of Jesus Christ through me, then I think as a Christian, that's what I'm called to do to others or for others. And then finally, this is, I was thinking of the term which people in the Winchester Diocese will be fully familiar with, which is, as Christians, we're called to be agents of social transformation, and we're better to live out that aspect of our faith and in further education. And when we talk about society at large, and we're called to be agents of social transformation, that begins with the individual. So whatever in my role I'm developing, curricula for hundreds or thousands of people, or I'm looking at courses, whether they're ESOL, higher education, provision with students with learning difficulties or disabilities, I always think about what transformation that curriculum, that offer will have on that individual. And if that transformation happens to 1, maybe 2, maybe 4, maybe 10, actually then we are talking about societal transformation. And that for me is at the heart of the gospel and at the heart of further education.
Now, it is well known, or perhaps hidden, that the Church of England doesn't run a single or sponsor a single FE college. What should the Church's relationship with FE be, and what would you like to see happen?
I think churches have a huge part to play, or should have a huge part to play in that social transformation. And I think what you see at the parish level is that there's relatively good engagement with their primary school. There'll be probably less, but a lot more than in FE, engagement between the church and secondary schools. And I'd be surprised if there isn't some form of chaplaincy service within every higher education institution in the country. And in further education, there'll be local arrangements, as we've done with St. Mary's next door to us in Southampton. But on that higher level, again, raising the profile of that partnership working between either the local church or the diocese and their local FE, again, I think can only be a good thing, because if we go back to the foundation of our faith being agents of social transformation, we're both trying to do the same thing. So actually, let's do it with all of our might, strength, and with all of our ability and our God-given gifts.
Thinking ahead, the Church of England is going to produce a vision for further education. Are you glad about that, or what are you hoping from that document, as it were?
I am, and I think what I'm hoping for is to see kind of formalized the kind of recognition of what a partnership between the Christian church and the further education sector can do for the communities that they serve. To have that kind of written down and as something tangible that can be discussed and debated and worked through and ultimately deliver can only be a good thing.
That's fantastic.